carbon pricing. What is it? There's been a lot of talk about it in the run-up to the COP21 Paris Climate Summit, and it's one of the main issues being discussed as a way to curb global warming. But what exactly is carbon pricing, and what does it entail? Fixing a price to carbon emissions is a way to harness market forces by sending an economic signal about the costs of polluting and to let businesses and other organizations choose whether they want to reduce their emissions or literally pay a price. There are generally two main ways that carbon pricing is implemented: an emissions trading system and a carbon tax. An emissions trading scheme is also called a cap and trade system. Governments cap the total level of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions at a fixed volume within their jurisdiction, allocate emissions permits among various firms, and those firms buy, sell, and trade the emissions permits among themselves. Think of it as firms paying each other for their right to pollute. Firms that have a small carbon footprint, for example, a software design company, can sell their permits to ones that have a lot of carbon in their activities, say an oil and gas company. An emissions trading system establishes a market price for greenhouse gas emissions, generating revenue in the process, while the cap helps ensure that emissions stay within a fixed amount. The second main way to price carbon is through a carbon tax. It's perhaps a bit more straightforward approach because it directly sets a price on carbon by defining a tax rate on greenhouse gas emissions. Businesses across the board who emit must pay. It's different from a cap and trade system because the actual volume of greenhouse gas emissions is not predefined. Rather, the price on them is. So what's the business case behind it? The private sector has been an outspoken proponent of putting some price on carbon. Businesses hate risk and uncertainty. While carbon pricing represents an added cost, the rationale is that public policy around carbon pricing at least gives the private sector a strong degree of certainty and predictability to make their necessary long-term investments going forward. So who's doing it? According to the World Bank, about 40 countries and more than 20 cities, states, and provinces already use carbon pricing mechanisms or are planning to implement them. Some of the notable standouts among developing and middle-income countries are Kazakhstan, which launched a cap and trade system in 2013, Mexico, which implemented a carbon tax in 2014, and Chile, which approved a carbon tax that will start in 2018. China made major headlines recently by announcing its intent to launch a nationwide carbon emissions trading system that will likely come into effect in early 2017. The single largest carbon market currently in force is still the European Union's cap and trade system, which regulates 30 countries. But the system has been criticized as a disappointment of sorts because of an over-allocation of carbon permits. An excess supply of permits caused their price to drop and therefore gave a weak incentive for business and industry to reduce their emissions. There are also indirect ways of pricing carbon, such as through fuel taxes or, importantly, particularly for developing countries, phasing out energy subsidies. According to the International Monetary Fund, energy subsidies in 2015 will amount to $5.3 trillion, or 6.5% of global GDP. That's more than governments around the world spend on public health, based on estimates from the World Health Organization. Developing countries often defend fossil fuel subsidies as poverty alleviation tools to protect poor segments of society from high fuel prices. But studies have shown that fossil fuel subsidies primarily benefit middle and upper income groups of society. Proponents of subsidy reform say that a better poverty alleviation strategy would be to raise fuel prices in a way that factors in their true costs and to use the new revenues to invest in social programs or even direct cash transfer programs targeted towards those most in need. Keep up with more carbon pricing news and innovative climate change solutions through Devex and our campaign, Planet Worth.